You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brulosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. When I think about the characteristics of beer I personally enjoy the most, a few descriptors come to mind. Clean fermentation character with bready malt that's balanced with a spicy and floral hop presence. As much as I enjoy darker and more hop-forward styles, there's just something about the simple drinkability of a pale lager that wets my whistle. You're listening to the Brulosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the beautiful style known as Czech Premium Pale Lager is contributor Andy Carter.
You know, Marshall, I think, a lot of people in the United States, they probably start drinking in college, maybe before college, but, maybe get appreciation for beer or alcohol. And one of the things, I liked beer in college, but I went to Belgium and I went to Berlin, and then I took a trip to Prague, and I got to have a Budweiser Budvar, not the American Budweiser. This is the real deal Pilsner from Czech Republic. And I got to tell you, that's really when I knew I wanted to make beer and have this kind of beer in my life for the rest of my life. It was really an eye-opening experience.
I'm telling you, I've got a story that I'll tell later on in the show about Budvar as well. And it was a life-changing, if you will, almost experience. So obviously, there are a number of different versions of pale lager that exist in the world these days, most of which are defined largely by the region where they were developed, which I think is pretty cool. Czech Premium Pale Lager is one of those styles, and it has quite a bit of history behind it, which I think makes it all the more interesting. I'm really excited to talk about this tasty beer style with you today, Andy, as well as how a batch brewed using short and shoddy methods turned out. All right, if you're into what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brulosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brulosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, April of 2022, the guys from Clawhammer Supply, Emmett Leahy and Kyle Brown, will be taking questions from patrons. If you haven't heard of Clawhammer Supply, you have to go check them out as soon as possible. They make really awesome all-in-one electric brewing systems in both 120 and 240 volt with various sizes, and they're also known for their really awesome distilling equipment. If you want to be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brulosophy by April 22nd, because the guys are going to be taking questions that Saturday, April 23rd. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. To check out all of the other rewards you can get for helping us do what we do, head to patreon.com/Brulosophy. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the gorgeous BH15 single-tier system, which comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brulosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. First bit of feedback comes from a listener named Neil, who emailed us with a bit of a correction after listening to our recent episode on hop thiols. Neil said Cade mentioned a thiol as a number of carbons with an OH at the end. While he was correct about ethyl alcohol, a thiol is a sulfur with a hydrogen rather than an oxygen with a hydrogen, with the sulfur being attached to a carbon chain of some length. So ethane thiol would be a 2-carbon length chain with an SH group on the end. Real quick, I just want to say that Cade is in fact aware of this error and apologizes for making it. Sometimes as we get to talking, we kind of misspeak, and it's hard to correct when it's a recorded show, like a podcast. So Cade is well aware of it. He noted it, in fact, before we received this email. But yes, you are right, Neil. Thanks for the email.
Yeah, I think this is one thing. I wish I had taken organic chemistry. I never had to in college. I think it would have actually paid a lot of rich dividends in homebrewing because of all the language and stuff. I know some people take it because of med school or whatever like that. And it's important because in the end, knowing these words, like we did our episode about language and pronunciation and meaning, it matters, right? Because if you start saying these things and then using the chemical notation of organic chemistry, how bonds break, how they reform, and what what precursors can occur. I mean, that's really everything in that is chemistry, that is brewing. So it's proper correction, and I know Cade would have caught that one. So not a big deal, but yeah, no, it is important because in the end, what compounds exist physically and how they're bonded means what reactions can and can't occur later on. So
right, exactly.
It's everything.
Yeah, no, and I always appreciate when people reach out with corrections like this because we don't want to be steering our listeners in the wrong direction. So thank you for that, Neil. All right, next bit of feedback is from Dustin Haug from St. Paul, Minnesota, who wrote in with an interesting idea related to water chemistry. Dustin says parts per million is a measurement of mass in milligrams per liter, but individual ions have different masses. For example, my water supply has an average chloride to sulfate ratio of 34 to 14 ppm. Based on this information alone, one might think there is more than twice as much chloride in my water supply, which as a mass ratio is true. However, if we're counting the number of ions, the ratio is actually 13 chloride ions for every 2 sulfate ions, a very different proportion. With the significance of water chemistry's impact on beer flavor, I thought this distinction seemed important. I realize it doesn't really change brewing practice. People will continue to use ppm measurements, but I felt like the idea was at least worthy of nerding out on.
Absolutely. ppm, parts per million, that's just like a measurement of like the dissolved content of whatever ion or whatever mass. And in the end, it's safest, and this is what I do remember from chemistry class, the safest thing to go back to is moles, which is the number of particles in a given amount of something. So it's the Avogadro's number, 6.626 times 10 to the 23rd particles is a mole of something. And then you have moles per gram or grams per mole or moles per liter and these things. And that gets you back to kind of basics because that tells you how many of a thing is in it. And then if you have, say, sodium chloride, NaCl, table salt, right? There's for every sodium Na, you have a chloride ion, right? And then when those come apart in solution, you have Na plus and Cl minus, right? So that's a salt, and then you have other salts we have in brewing. Now, like he said, these compounds matter, and some people like to talk about the sulfite to chloride ratio in brewing for balance or things like that. And so tracking all those numbers is important. Though I will kind of say on top of that, using good software is important, like Brew and Water or Brewfather or anything like that to track all these things. Knowing your base water helps too. The other thing I'll just stress or just mention is these compounds drastically change during the brewing process too. Your malt has these compounds in them. Your hops have some of these things. So yes, your starting waters matter, but as you get into it, and I've had professional brewing friends take their wort samples and send them off to the lab, the sulfite, the manganese, everything changes drastically during the brewing process too.
Yeah.
So there's all the things on top of it, and all your other ingredients actually do affect your water, salt, quote unquote, salt chemistry just as much as those water additions do.
Yeah, I really appreciate feedback like this, not necessarily because it's going to have some impact on the way I do things. It won't, kind of like Dustin mentioned, but because it just makes me think about things a little bit differently, which I find interesting. I've been happy with the way I determine my water profile. But again, this is really interesting stuff. It makes sense to me that paying attention to the ions might actually maybe give like a different, a way to kind of tune things a little bit more finely, right? I don't know. I don't think people are going to be changing the way that they're doing their water chemistry, but the fact that I'd never even considered the difference between mass and actual ion count, it's kind of interesting. So thanks for the feedback, Dustin. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. All right, when we return from this break, the focus will be on Czech Premium Pale Lager. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As much as I enjoy all of the fun and adventurous beer styles that exist these days, my true liquid love is and will likely always be crisp, crushable, clear pale lager. Yep, I have no shame admitting that I am a beer-flavored beer guy, and one that easily makes my top 3 list of favorite styles. It's a classic in my opinion, has got to be Czech Premium Pale Lager.
Yeah, so if you look at the history of this, I think a lot of people, when we say lager, pilsner, pilsen, we think German, because so much of U.S. brewing or United States or North American brewing is originated from either England or Germany, right? But really, the real history is starting in the Czech Republic or Bohemia or whatever word you want to use to describe this area of Europe. And really, the root of this, what we'll describe as a lighter colored, medium bodied, fairly hoppy lager is from Pilsen in the Czech Republic. And it all started around like the 1840s by a man named Josef Groll. It was the beginning of what we now call Pilsner Urquell. That was the first brewery that started making this kind of golden colored lager. And that was the rise of Pilsner in Europe. And then subsequently, this technique of cold fermentation, the crispness, the dryness, all these kind of things transferred over into Germany. Of course, over time, German technology, German brewing practice changed the beer quite a bit, though it still retains a lot of the similarities. So today's kind of topic of premium Pilsner is this slight subcategory of the Pilsen style, and it's interesting because they take it. We have all these styles of beer in the United States, right? They go all over the place, but here there's a lot of distinction even between slight things, and specifically in the original gravities of these beers.
Yeah, and I think it people are going to be confused probably if you've been brewing for a while and maybe you're not a BJCP judge. You're like, why are they calling it a Czech Premium Pale Lager? It's because that's what the BJCP calls it now, and so it's a way for us to kind of categorize it. It is also very popularly known as Bohemian Pilsner or Bo Pils. And that is if you hear people talk about, I mean, I don't know about, I can't speak for everybody, but locally here, my homebrew friends, there's always like a divide between who likes Bo Pils better than German Pils and vice versa. Mm-hmm. This is the Bo Pils that people are talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in this style of brewing, and you have to remember, again, this is when these styles were being invented, so there wasn't a ton of playing around with a lot of different ingredients and stuff. There's another style that's in the same same category in the BJCP. It's just called Czech Pilsner, or Czech lager, or Czech style lager versus premium lager. And the only difference there is the gravity. So they talk about degrees. Plato, we call them degrees. Plato, they just call them degrees. And so 10 or 12, these are different versions of a beer that has slightly different higher gravities, therefore higher alcohol, right? But we don't go too high, right? They go from like 4% to about 6%. And we're going to talk about the higher end, the 5 to 6% type beer today. So the only difference here, we're talking about the strength. Now, of course, everything in balance, right? So if you're trying to make this style of beer, and this style, we'll get into the real details in a minute, but this style of beer tends to be a little maltier than other examples. So you're going to balance that hop bitterness accordingly, right? And how hoppy, how aroma wise, and everything like that. So there's slight differences, but really it's the alcohol content or the original gravity in this case.
Yeah, the strength. I mean, that's pretty common when you look at the way the BJCP breaks down regional styles. Usually, if there's a premium or something labeled like that, it's because of the strength, and that's really the biggest difference. So when you look at Czech Pale Lager versus Czech Premium Pale Lager, the difference there is just OG, the starting gravity. So, all right, let's break this style dial down a little bit in terms of the descriptions and what they're supposed to look, smell, and taste like. You already kind of described the way a good Czech Premium Pale Lager looks. If anyone has ever gone to a baseball game and ordered a Budweiser or a Miller Lite, that's basically it. Maybe a little bit darker than your classic American light lagers, because of the fact that you're kind of adding a little bit of oomph using more malt, and that malt is going to naturally make a more golden color as opposed to that pale straw color.
Yeah, and I think that's a big, the big thing. If as I always say, as you go from the east to the west, right? You go from Czech to Germany to the United States, right? Things just get lighter, right? Lighter and lower in bitterness is a nice way to think about it, right? That's how we've gone to now. Hey, lighter. Hey, we're making seltzer now, so it's the lightest thing you can make, right?
That's the lightest it can get.
That's the lightest you can get, right? So, in any case, these malts, you have to remember 1800s. This is not the premium manufacturing that we're used to today, right? For better or for worse. So malts that have less, the kilning temperatures are a little off. The malts will be a little darker. They relied on decoction, probably open flame boiling and mash tuns, right? So you're never going to have that color. And I think it's important to recognize that, because when we describe the beer style, how it's still made over there, right? We can import all of the malt we want, but we don't have their brew house, right? So you have to remember that those things are characteristic of that beer. And when you go over there and have the beer, and I always stress this when we talk about these styles, you really need to go over to wherever this is made to have it as the best example.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And so in any case, little darker in color, slightly, right? We're talking degrees of SRM, right? And then I think a very, very big characteristic thing here, and then something that the United States is importing, is how it's poured, and specifically to create that dense, long-lasting, foamy, creamy head, almost like a cottage cheese or like almost a yogurt-like. And that's from not only the speed at which it's poured and how you pour it and everything, but also the protein content of the malt itself.
Yeah, exactly. And if you've ever seen like a slow pour pills, I have a feeling that's kind of what you're referring to, Andy.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. The idea there, I don't think it's going to affect really the other characteristics of the beer other than the way that beautiful head looks, and that's an important aspect, right? We eat with our eyes first, and so making sure that this is a nice gold to deep gold color, has that brilliant clarity. I know people don't like to talk about clarity in beer these days. These types of beers really should be as clear as you can get them. That's in the olden days, I would say that's a sign of a well lagered beer. Whereas these days we can use other techniques for expediting, we'll say, the clarity of a beer, and so it's just a sign of a well-made Czech premium pale lager.
Yeah, and I think that's important. It's a very important distinction you make there, because clarity, it also comes from the fact that glass was becoming more popular around this time. I'm not 100% sure when but I remember reading that glass and clear beer was kind of going hand in hand. Like seeing this clear beverage was a sign of a high quality beverage. And like you said, it only took time to filter out stuff. Now we have mechanical filtration, chemical filtration, all these things. So you could speed up the process, right? But there is a correlation to the clarity, the maturation, all these things. So
exactly,
it's important. It's a definitely important aspect of appearance. I mean, it's only a few points on the BJCP score sheet, but you said it's the first thing you see, it's the first thing you taste, quote unquote. So
yeah. Aromatically speaking, this is a beer that's going to be made primarily, if not completely, with a very lightly kilned Pilsner malt, and so you expect to get some of that bready, maybe a little bit of a doughy character on the nose. Medium low to medium high spicy floral and herbal hops. And again, we're going to get more into the ingredients used in this, but these are beers that are made with Saaz hops. And so that is the character you expect to get from a good Czech premium pale lager. Low diacetyl is acceptable. Again, this is according to the BJCP. I've known this for a long time. I don't know how sensitive I really am to diacetyl. I've done a few flavor standard tests myself, and I've been able to nail it sometimes, and then other times it goes right over my head. I'm not going to lie about that. So I don't like when I do pick up diacetyl. I really don't like it. So I'm kind of a don't have diacetyl there at all if you can avoid it.
Yeah. I think that there's two things there. One is knowing it can be there you should definitely put that into your mind when you're judging this beer, to be objective. To be an objective judge, you're trying to say, I don't like this flavor, but it can be here and I will accept it, even if it detracts from maybe it takes something from your final score, right? The next thing is, and this gets a little bit in the weeds, but I think from my memory of having this in Europe, is that when the right malts, hops, yeast character is combined with diacetyl, that
call it what you want,
that you get a different experience than having it in made with more US ingredients, US techniques, stuff like that. So I think it's acceptable when it's all together, right? It's when it's in harmony with the beer, not just sticking out like a sore thumb. So,
but I would contend in a well-made Czech Premium Pale Lager that if there is diacetyl present, that it is so harmonious that you don't really notice it. It's not
exactly.
And so it's kind of like, well, I guess if you're really picking nits, you might point out that there is a buttery diacetyl character going on, but it works with the beer, so I wouldn't, you don't really notice it. It doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, like you said. Now,
exactly.
In talking about the flavor of a CPPL, if you will, it kind of follows the aroma. It's rich, complex, bready malt, pronounced yet soft, rounded bitterness. I think that's key for this style. You do expect there to be a decent, I don't know if I would define it as assertive bitterness, but this nice, it balanced, you're using more malt to get that OG up a little bit. You need to balance that with bitterness, and you're going to get a good portion of that bitterness is going to come from a low alpha SOTS hop, and so being able to balance that really well, and not to mention that you can also have a little bit of hop derived esters. That's a completely acceptable thing in this style as well. In fact, I think a lot of us these days, what's one of the things we love about Bow Pils over German Pils, which has a slightly different presentation of the hops.
The thing I want to also get to in this is that this, having this bitterness, we talk about bitterness and you have different calculators for bitterness and stuff like that. And just paying attention to IBUs is one thing, but how you calculate it, something I've noticed on the course of doing a lot of beer experiments, right, where we tend to pick recipes that are simple, right? They might not be a beer recipe you'd always just brew, like, I'm going to make it this myself. Though I will say I really do like a lot of the recipes I've come up with, even though they're very simple, they're really well executed. I think they turn out well. The 60-minute hop edition is so underrated in terms of its flavor and aroma impact. I have a beer on tap right now that only has 60 minutes, and man, you'd be like, wow, Andy, what hops did you use? Because I can really get a lot of hop aroma. It was only 60 minutes, and I think that's really important. The low alpha, which means you're going to add a lot of ounces, right, to get your bitterness up. That aroma and flavor impact is so amazing and so critical, I think, to some of these lighter lager styles. You're sleeping on it if you're not thinking about that 60-minute bitterness addition. So.
Yeah, and that is something that's going to come up later as we talk about my short and shoddy version of this style. So keep that in mind. Now, again, in terms of flavor, this is a point that I feel is very important after discussing diacetyl, is that a good Bow Pils can have a touch of caramel on the palate. You can pick up a little bit of that caramelly thing that you get from the usage of a high amount of even Pilsner malt, or perhaps the decoction, right? If you're using a decoction mash for this, I wonder if that caramel note is perhaps that a fermentation characteristic, I mean, maybe that is what people are perceiving is just that hint of diacetyl, but it's so in harmony with all of the other components of this beer that it's just perceived as kind of this other malty aspect, I mean,
it makes sense. I mean, again, like when it's at low levels and it just combines with other things, that's a different flavor, right? It's only when it's strong and by itself. And I think, like I said about ingredients, I think that American style beers, which are derived much less on malt and much more on fruity hops and buttery diacetyl, is just a combination of just bad. It's just bad, right? So that's a difference. So that's, I think, the big difference. But it makes sense to me.
Yep. In terms of mouthfeel, you expect a medium body. That sounds pretty on point with the OG of this style. And then you want moderate to low carbonation. That is completely subjective in my opinion. I know that there's like Pilsner Urquell does the off the cask, their unfiltered Pilsner Urquell. It's amazing. I've had it one time. It's absolutely phenomenal. Unfortunately, I was not in the Czech Republic. I was in Ireland. I was in Ireland of all places. How weird is that, right?
Nice. That's
I know.
Awesome,
and there was this whole Pilsner Urquell bar right in Dublin that I went to, and they had. It was my favorite place that I went there, which I wasn't even there for that. I thought was kind of funny. But I tend to prefer, I've talked about this a million times, more moderate to moderate high carbonation for any Pilsner style personally.
And I'll just real quick on the cask thing. You can get it in the United States sometimes. They do import a cask to some special bars. For carbonation, it's interesting because I find that carbonation, especially as the beer OG gets lower, the carbonation you pick is really important to go from something that is flat and kind of bland to exactly correct to oh, this tastes like seltzer water now, right? So really dialing in your carbonation locally is important. So I would say, especially for this, I would start low and then creep it up a little bit just to dial it in perfectly, because you want that crispness comes not only from the hop bitterness, the dryness, or the how your malt complexity comes out, but also the carbonation. So pick a middle road of carbonation, but don't be scared to go up a little bit. But there is like a cliff essentially after that. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. All right, real quick, we're just going to run down the vital stats. You're looking at 1044 to 1060 OG, 1013 to 1017 FG, which results in a beer that's between 4.2 to 5.8% ABV. Obviously, those are all just parameters that were put there by the BJCP to try to help us organize our thoughts about this specific style. IBU, you're looking at 30 to 45 IBU. Again, that's pretty high up there. I mean, this is not a flabby, unbitter beer. This is going to have a little bit of that bitterness oomph, yeah?
I mean, 30, you think about that, right? 30 to 45 IBUs in a beer with this very little caramel or color or anything like that seems like a lot, but I do agree. It's got to be this high. And this is, again, in balance with the malt bill. And we'll get into malt bill in a minute. But, that's an important thing. And so don't be scared of this IBU, especially when it's this big first edition. And remember, like I said, 60 minutes is going to provide a lot of aroma, a lot of flavor in the hops. So.
Yep. Yeah, it's so hard to break away from that. At least the way a lot of us were trained back, 2 decades ago, is 60-minute bitterness, 30-minute flavor, 15 and lower is your aroma. No, you get aroma and flavor from those 60-minute additions as well. So that is especially important when you're brewing styles like Bo Pills. So, all right, real quick, SRM, you're looking at 3.5 to 6 SRM. Again, gold to dark gold. I mean, that is a pretty classic Pilsner color. So, all right, this is probably the easiest grain bill that we've ever had to talk about for a style. When you're making a Czech Premium Pale Lager, you're looking to use, just really one malt, right?
Yep. Yeah. So Czech Pilsner malt or Moravian Pilsner malt. Of course, it's a little more difficult to acquire these malts in the United States. So I would just be shopping around a little bit. There are places that do import these things. It can be tough to find. I would say not as a cheat, but just to consider this, to get that maltiness up, especially as we've been talking so much about balancing the malt with the hops, is to probably cut your local Pilsner malt with maybe a little bit of a Munich or a little bit of something darker, just to provide a bump in the malt flavor. The other option here is also to look at the more craft malts available in the United States now: Admiral, Mecca Grade, Sugar Creek, that kind of thing. And I think you might be more successful in recreating this style with using a more characterful malt from one of those producers.
Yeah, and another thing that I'll hear quite often actually is the importance, quote unquote, of using under-modified malt, and then in doing that, some people prefer to do a decoction mash, and that is absolutely a possibility. Something people are making great beers doing here. I personally, my experience using these what I call craft malts is that they are a bit more characterful, for better or for worse. Sometimes, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that's always what I'm looking for. There are sometimes I just want that nice Weirman Pilsner malt character,
Absolutely.
But with a Bo Pils like this, I feel like that character really does contribute to the gestalt of this style. For as simple as the malt bill is, now I would never use Munich malt in a Bohemian Pilsner, but I know people who do, and it's literally just a whisper of it, maybe 2%. And it adds that bump, right? Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Now, this is not a style that you're going to put adjuncts in. You're not going to be using flaked maize or anything like that. This is a 100%. This is a 100% malt based beer. So
yeah, and of course. And so hopping wise, again, very simple. Saaz hops. That's what you need. That's what you got to use.
That's it.
I wouldn't. I mean, you could look at other noble hops, or continental hops, so to speak, over there. But this is, I think, a critical choice, much like a Tettnang or something else in the German style would be important to recreate the specific flavors of those beers.
Yeah.
And I would try, it'd be interesting, even experiment to try, the leaf versus a pellet. Just because where they're going to come from and when they were picked, it could be a bit of a difference. But yeah, Saaz is the way to go.
I mean, that is what helped. You think about what is it that made Czech Premium Pale Lager, Bohemian Pilsner, put it on the map? What is that? Well, we know it's the water. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's also Saaz. I mean, that is what we know. Now, I've made a mock Bohemian Pilsner one time with all Mount Hood hops, which I believe is a Hallertau derivative, an American hop that was came from Hallertau or whatever, and it was great. Don't get me wrong, but it was not a Sots-based Bohemian Pilsner. To me, that is such a defining characteristic of this style that if I'm making a Bo Pils, I'm using Sots.
Absolutely. So yeast, Czech lager yeast would be where to go. There's many different options actually, and it's actually really, I think, encouraging or educational to try them, especially if you're really getting into it, to try the different versions, because while they may call themselves analogs, they're not going to be the same.
Yeah.
So Imperial Yeast makes one, L28 or Urkel, Y Yeast 2278 or the Czech Lager, and then White Labs has two of them, WLP 800 Pilsner Lager or WLP 802 the Czech Budweis Lager. And those are, I would try all these things. I think some people maybe have a bad experience with one and then they dump it forever. They never try it again. But it's worth trying. I mean, these are lager yeasts. I mean, they can be a little more finicky sometimes. You might get this diacetyl thing that we've talked about, and maybe one makes more, one makes less, and so you got to try them out. But all these are excellent strains to try and see how your results come out.
Yeah, I've used all four of those strains over the years. The very first one I ever used was the WLP 800, but I've since moved, and I believe 800 and then Y Yeast 2278 and Imperial Yeast L28. I believe all of those are purportedly sourced from, Imperial Yeast calls theirs Urkel. Come on. They're sourced from Pilsner Urquell.
Yeah.
And so, and then obviously WLP 802, that is going to be sourced from Budvar, and the original Budweiser, if you will. The one issue that I've found using the Pilsner Urquell yeast is that it has a slow start, and I don't quite understand what's going on. I've pitched it after making huge starters. I've pitched it fresh, a 2-week-old pouch, fresh into a low OG beer, and it just seems to not kick off as quickly. So the reason I say that as an aside, is that don't worry. If you pitch a pouch of Urkel or 2278 from Y Yeast or WLP 800 and it's not kicking along 12 hours later, give it some time. Keep that temperature where you want it. Give it some time, and don't worry too much about it, because in my experience, that has not led to disaster, so to speak. Sure. So, all right. So traditional brewing process. This is where we get into a little bit of fun, because I do feel like of all of the aspects of Czech Premium Pale Lager, of all Czech beers, really, the one thing that is notable is the fact that they rely on very soft water in Pilsen, right? So it's low sulfate and carbonate content. I know people who make this style, Bohemian Pilsner with just like water from the store, Arrowhead or whatever, because it's already low. And then one of the things you want to keep in mind is you want that calcium content up so that your fermentation is good, but you don't need it to be super high. And this is you want that soft water note that you get when you don't have a very high mineral water.
Yeah, and this is, like we said, it's critical to the style because of where the water is being sourced over there, right? So the one way to make it here, because we have the technology, is we don't have a well that's very clean and very low mineral content. You have RO water versus osmosis water. Great starting point. And but also you don't want to shirk your responsibilities to your yeast, right? They're going to need some calcium, some micronutrients that, depending on how good your RO system is, if it's really dialed in, it's going to be very, very low. And so don't want to ignore that. And I would just, like we said, a whisper of these things. It just to keep the yeast happy, and like Marshall mentioned, this yeast strain might take some time to take off, so you don't want to give it any negative starting points. So just a little bit, and that softness just provides that beer that, rather than maybe it's easier to talk about the opposite, which is having a lot of sulfate or a lot of chloride. It's going to push the mouthfeel in one direction where you don't want to go. You just want this blank canvas for the hops and the malt to sit on.
Yeah, and that is how I perceive good versions of this beer, is that it just tastes like malt with hops. It's amazing. So start with soft water. I mean, that is key for this style, in my opinion. Whereas, and to contrast that with German Pils, this sounds nuts. I go with high sulfate. I mean, I'll go with like 90 ppm of sulfate. Yeah, because I want it to be sharper, right?
Yes. Yeah, you want water content in the German style. Every time, like I said, I mentioned I lived in Berlin and then I was in Prague and trying Budvar. But the German styles, and this is not a German style episode, but their water is much more serious, right? What kind of water they use, especially having the mineral content, is critical for those beers.
Yep, absolutely. All right, for the mash, you're looking at a standard 60-minute, if you're not doing a decoction, of course. Now, decoction mashing was a technique that was implemented for a very specific purpose, to drive conversion. We don't don't really need that with the hot malts we've got today. But there are people out there who swear that decoction adds melanoidin content, adds a caramely flavor. So by all means, if that's what you're looking at, go ahead and go do that. A standard 60-minute single infusion at around 148F to 154F, which is 64 to 68C, will get the job done as well. And then this is one, when it comes to the boil, I feel like this doesn't get talked about nearly as much today as it did just 5 or 10 years ago. But you're using a high, it could be up to 100% Pilsner malt. So you got to boil for 90 minutes to drive off DMS and SMM, right?
Yeah. So I think this is like you said, I think we were harping on this, or people were harping on this earlier. I would say my experience, not only in experiments, but my general tasting of beer and competitions and stuff, is this a negative thing or a positive thing? It's an open question. Modern malt it's really tough to make DMS.
Yeah.
The SMM precursor has been really minimized. And this is, you got to thank the technology and malt scientists, right? They have figured out how to grow it, germinate it, kiln it, everything to minimize it. Now, we've lost some character, or maybe something is your process changes. Now you're allowing yourself to lower you're allowing yourself to not boil as long or change your processes because of that, right? And that's going to change the character of the beer. I'm not going to boil for 90 minutes in this case, but it is important. And I would say as we go and look at craft malt again, that's when it's probably going to be really important to do the 90 minutes, because they're not going to look and say, okay, the SMM is not going to be as minimized. You should be boiling that long. So
yeah. Well, and another benefit to a 90-minute boil over a 60-minute boil for a style like this, where I think a lot of people are using only SOTs. If you have a 3.5% alpha, SOTs, and you boil for 90 minutes, and that's your first addition, your bitterness addition, you're going to get more isomerization, arguably. Now, I know that there's some talk out there about 60 minutes kind of being the limit, like that's where you're going to get maximum isomerization. But no, I think if you're really trying to maximize, I guess, the efficiency of your hopping, do a 90-minute boil and toss in a first wort hop or something like that. I think, that's going to work well for you. So once the boil is complete, you're going to chill that wort as quickly as possible to ensure a good cold break. Again, clarity is very important in this style, and traditionally, clear wort leads to clear beer. We know that that's not necessarily the case these days, but if there is any flavor impact from the trub, you don't want that in this very, very clean, pure style. You want to leave as much of that trub in the kettle as possible. I know people, when they're making Bohemian Pilsner, who will rack is the clearest wort possible to one vessel, let it settle overnight before pitching the yeast, and then only rack the very clear wort to another fermentation vessel before they actually pitch their yeast. It's one of those things that for this style, you're doing everything you can to limit the flavor impact of anything other than the malt and hops, really.
Yeah. I think obviously if you're dead set on making this way, I think this is important and you should do it. I think there was some data, suggesting too little trub is a problem. Or it's at least a different beer. So there's some impact there. But yeah, I know I have many friends that are obsessed with the clarity of their wort at every stage of this process. And so, yes, I had not heard of someone doing the cold, I think you're calling it a cold rest prior to racking again, but that's an interesting thing. It's actually probably makes sense. I will say though, my experience trying, brewing on these Bruzillas, right? These stainless steel all-in-ones. I do think that chilling inside the rather than chilling inline, right, with a counterflow chiller, chilling inline like an immersion chiller, leaving stuff in the kettle really does help your beer clarity overall. So it is important. So I would opt, in my opinion, I would opt for an immersion chiller rather than a counterflow chiller in this case, but that's just some observation I had over time. So
yeah. Well, speaking of chilling, this is definitely a style that you are supposed to ferment very cool. Down around 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 9 to 11 C. I have a friend who ferments all of his Pilsner at 46 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 8 degrees C. That's pretty cold. It's going to take a while. He's pitching 4-liter starters. Going that whole route. Yeah, I know. But he makes fantastic beer, so you can't argue with him on that. And hey, when it's your hobby, you can do it however you want to. And
exactly.
I do believe, this is one of those styles that is expected to be cold fermented with a traditional lager strain like L28 Urquell. When that beer is done fermenting, some people I know like to batch lager it, and there are two routes that I've heard people using. Some just keep it in primary, which I know is more common these days than it used to be. But then others will rack the beer under pressure if you can, so you can avoid oxidation, rack it to another vessel, and then do your batch lagering there. For people who keg, that's very easy because you can just rack it to a keg and throw it in your kegerator for 6 months or 10 years or however long you want to save the beer. You can use filtration, whether mechanical or chemical. I don't think that's necessarily, again, this is the Czech Republic, not Germany, so they're not necessarily bound by the Reinheitsgebot, right? If you want to add some sort of a chemical fining agent, or if you want to run it through a mechanical filter, I think that's perfectly acceptable. You really, again, you're looking to reduce oxidation while improving clarity.
Yeah, and like we said, I think we always say this, that every time you're racking is like minimizing oxygen is so critical for every beer style.
Yes.
And given how light and delicate this beer is, I mean, you're going to notice this oxidation much more quickly in this style. Not as maybe as quickly as like hazy IPA or something like that, but it's going to come out eventually. So I'm in the camp of, I'm not inclined to necessarily go get plate filters and stuff. I just so scared of oxidation, but that might be what you need to do. But I do think, if you're going to lager this, especially if you're committed to it where you have the space to lager, and giving this the 60 to 90 days in keg to lager is, I think that's absolutely what you need to do. And guess what? I think if you do wait that long with some finings and just some upfront clarity, you're going to have a very clear beer at the end of that. So
yeah, and I mean that's the thing is like we are those of us who tend to be a little bit more impatient with our brewing. A part of what we're saying is, hey, look, using these different, more modern methods, I can get away with making a really good Bow Pils, in 3 weeks as opposed to 9 weeks. But we are not saying that if you do it the traditional way and wait that 9 weeks with a 6 week lagering period and all of that you're not going to make a good beer. In fact, you're probably going to be really pleased with what comes out at the end. The very first Bow Pils I ever made, I believe I made it 11 weeks before I started drinking it, and it was phenomenal. That keg went massively fast. So again, we are not speaking ill of traditional methods. We're just looking at different ways to do stuff with this whole short and shoddy thing. So once that beer is done lagering though, or if it's already in the package, you're ready to carbonate it and serve it. You don't need to do a slow pour in your house. That is, I do believe that's mostly for show, but I would, if you're going by the BJCP, you're looking at like 2.3 to 2.5 volumes. I would aim more for like that 2.6 to 2.7, but that's just personal preference. And I prefer to let that carbonation knock out on its own so that people can kind of have a little bit of control over the carbonation of their beer. And you can't do that if it's low carbonation. So,
exactly. You can remove it. Though I will say, like, there's this transient behavior of like, if it's very carbonated, it hits your tongue. I think your tongue gets a little more numb to that. So I would play with that. The other thing is that we were doing a history on this, this is a beer style that's kind of like English beer tradition where you're sitting down, having pints, knocking them back, talking to people. Yep. So you're getting this and you're having one of the same for a few of these. And I like the idea of having a little higher carbonation because that first one has a higher carbonation. Your next one, if you're slipping more slowly, the carbonation is going down over time as you're drinking it. So you get a different experience as you're drinking it. Each one is a little bit different. Whereas if you start low, you're going to be flat at some point. At some point too. So
yeah. So overall, this is a style that you're looking to have clean fermentation character, bready malt aroma and flavor with hints of spicy, floral, or herbal hops. The beer should be refreshing and insanely drinkable. That is. Now, again, there's Czech Pale Lager, but this Czech Premium Pale Lager is equally as crushable, in my opinion. If you're looking for commercial examples to try, go pick yourself up some Pilsner Urquell. Chances are it's going to be in a green bottle. It's going to taste a little skunky. I'm not sure if Pilsner Urquell is one of the breweries that intentionally does that for the American market. Mm-hmm. But if you go into certain specialty shops, and I've found it on the East Coast when I'm out visiting family over there, you can sometimes find the original Budweiser Budvar. And I highly recommend, even if it's a little long in the tooth, it's not going to be as good as what you get in the Czech Republic. Pick it up and give it a go, and you will see what we're talking about. It is a completely different experience than an American pale lager. So there's Primator Premium as well as another popular one. I've had that a couple of times, very good. But go pick up some Bow Pils and try it out for yourself. Now, the first time I had a legit Czech Premium Pale Lager was back in 2003 while on a trip to Latvia with my wife. I've mentioned before that her family is from Latvia. We were staying with her beer-loving uncle in a gorgeous suburb of Riga, Latvia called Meža Parks. And every night he'd bring home a couple bottles of beer that I can't find in America, usually from Latvian breweries. But one night he handed me a bottle that had this familiar name. It was Budweiser Budvar. And he explained that this was the original Budweiser that inspired the whole mass market American stuff we all know today. That beer, like I've mentioned, was absolutely incredible. And it was, being so close to Czech Republic, it was far fresher than what I've been able to find out here in the States. But it absolutely served as inspiration for the very first lager I ever brewed, which was a Bohemian Pilsner. Well, I've since made many batches of Bo Pils, a recent one using methods that many will likely cringe at. How did it turn out? That's what we're going to be talking about when we're back from this break. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear, Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. As anyone who has ever brewed a pale lager knows, the recipe isn't really the difficult part, at least in my opinion, especially when it comes to Czech Premium Pale Lagers. It usually just contains one malt and one hop variety. What keeps people from brewing styles like this is the process, much of which is said to be absolutely necessary to ensure a quality finished product. Well, I was curious to see how many corners I could cut, and I brewed up a Czech Premium Pale Lager using short and shoddy methods, various corner cutting methods that we'll see what people think about here. Now, this was done on my 240 volt SS Brewtech 1V electric system, so that significantly reduces the amount of time to heat water and wort up, which is nice. I started this batch at 3:51 p.m. one Monday afternoon, collected the full volume of water, which I run through an RV filter, and I made no mineral adjustments. So I'm pretty lucky because the water that I get at my house 90% of the year is very soft. It's not well water. I think in total it's got like 6 ppm of sulfate and like I think 8 ppm of
That's
of
really
chloride.
low. Yeah.
The calcium is lower than 50 ppm. I think it's like 36 total. But
Wow.
I left it alone. I was looking going, hey, I've already got Pilsen type water. Why mess with it? I'm doing short and shoddy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you didn't have to do any work, right? This is the process. This whole concept is don't stress, just go.
Just go with it. Exactly.
And you already have the right water, so go for it.
Yeah, and to be fair, I've used my mineralized water many times to make this style, and it always works out fine. So I knew what to expect on it.
This is not, short and shoddy is not an uneducated.
No,
it's not uneducated. Geez. It's obviously relying on your previous experience to make beer as rapidly as possible.
Exactly, and to have a little bit of fun doing it, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Now for this one, I did use 100% Pilsner style malt, but it was Mecca grade estate malt Pelton Pilsner style malt. This is a malt that I've used used many, many times. And if you recall me ever commenting on getting a subtle whisper of like a vanilla note when I'm using this malt, that this is what it is. And so I was kind of curious to see how, this Oregon-based Pilsner malt would play in a Bohemian Pilsner, where I've usually used, a mass market Pilsner malt.
Nice. Yeah, I think this is a great idea, because really you're going to get away from the kind of maybe cookie cutter experience with some of the commercialized larger scale malts. And so using Mecca Grade, makes perfect sense here.
Yeah. I was excited to see how it'd come out. So now when the water was to strike temperature, the grains were added and stirred to incorporate before I checked to ensure it was at my target mash temperature of 151 Fahrenheit or 66 C. I left the mash alone for just 30 minutes, not this 60-minute craziness that normal people do, after which I removed the grains and started to heat that wort up. I then boiled the wort for just 25 minutes. Now, what this means is, given the low alpha of the sots that I was using, and I was using Czech sots, I had to add 125 grams.
That's a lot of grams.
Yeah, it's a lot of freaking hops. We're talking, what is that? That's almost 5 ounces or so. Yeah. So 125 grams of sots, and I did that at a first wort hot. So basically what that means is, when I removed the grain bag, I tossed the 125 grams of sots in there and then left them in while the wort was coming up to a boil. I then added another 50 grams of sots at 10 minutes and 30 grams of sots at 2 minutes. So this had a lot of hops in it. We're up, just a bump over 200 grams total.
So I think paying attention, right? Normally you would be doing some type of 60-minute edition if this was not the quick version of this, right? So the flavor impact, I think, is going to be a lot bigger than maybe you would expect, just because the ounceage is so high, or the grammage is so high, right? So there's bitterness, but there's also a lot of flavor. So this should be really interesting, actually.
Exactly. And who knows what to expect when you're using that much, that technically late in the boil, right? So I was kind of curious to see how this would work out. So when that 25-minute boil was complete, I did chill the wort with my Jaded Scylla immersion chiller. This is it's an immersion chiller that is made specifically for these electric units.
Yeah.
And I was able to get the wort down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 C in about 5 or 6 minutes. So then I let that wort sit for maybe just 2 or 3 minutes before racking it to a fermentation tank, a Delta Firm tank. I took a refractometer reading, and it showed that the wort was right at 1054 OG, so 74% brewhouse efficiency. That is not common. That is not common in my experience doing short and shoddy, but it is very common for me to get a little bit higher efficiency than I might when I'm using 100% Pilsner malt. I don't know why. I don't know what the secret is there, but whenever I brew beers using a large amount of Pilsner malt, I tend to get a little bit better efficiency than when I'm using a pale malt. And nobody's been able to tell me why, but it happens. And in this case, 1054 OG is beautiful for this style, 74% efficiency. I was pretty pleased.
Yeah, I wonder if it has something to do with the enzymatic power of a lighter malt color. Maybe it's just got a little bit more oomph to it. Just doesn't need as much time. It's interesting. Malt having the enzymatic power, maybe it just got the diastatic power that we're missing in another malt. Could be. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know either. And I will say that when I do a standard 60-minute mash rest using 100% Pilsner malt, whether it's Mecca Grade or Weyermann, I'm usually in that 76 to 78%. Sure. So you can argue that I took a small hit, but for a 30-minute mash rest to get 74% brewhouse efficiency, I was pretty pleased with that. So
great.
Yeah. So all right. So then the wort was racked to a Delta Firm tank. These are those 8-gallon firm tanks that I absolutely love. And then I pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast L28 Urkel. I believe at the time, I forget what the date was on it, but I believe it was about 2 months old. So not at the end of its life by any means. And it is 200 billion cells in one of these pouches, but 1054 OG wort, this is arguably an underpitch. So would it have an impact? Who knows, right? At this point, the time was 5:38 p.m. for a total brew day time of just 1 hour and 47 minutes. That's nuts.
Yeah, that's awesome, dude. Again, you know your system. You have 240 volt, not 120 volt like me, so you can do it fast. And you cut the corners, but you also change the recipe against those corners, so it's makes sense. This is great.
So at this point, I did connect the filled fermentation tank to my glycol chiller, and I know people are like, "Oh, that's not short and shoddy." It's not. We're using the gear that we like because out of convenience, we're cutting other corners. So I pitched the yeast. Just a reminder, I pitched the yeast into the 70 degree Fahrenheit or 21 degree Celsius wort, and then I connected the fermenter thermometer to my glycol chiller and set it to 66 degrees Fahrenheit. So, you're looking at about 16 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, maybe 9 degrees C warmer than what you would normally, ferment this yeast at. So again, more corners being cut, but the idea being to shave off some time that it takes to turn this beer around. I let that beer ferment for 1 week before taking a hydrometer measurement showing that it had reached 1009 FG. Again, beautiful, 5.9% ABV, a hair higher than the BJCP recommends, but who cares, right?
Yep. Well, at least get up to those alcohol levels. Though I will say, in general, this is something I think a little bit more of the Czech or the German style is that the darker beers tend to have a little higher gravity. So you'd expect this beer to be the darker lagers. But no, this is well within, I think 6 is like the high end, but I think this is fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like 5.9%.
Sure.
That's a good
Boom.
number.
It's a good number.
All right. Since the beer was done fermenting, I did cold crash by setting my glycol chiller to 34 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree C, and I left it overnight before I added gelatin. Another very, very common short and shoddy approach that I do to try to expedite the clarification process. I left that beer alone at that 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree C for 5 days. One could argue that was a brief lagering period. Before I pressure transferred it to a CO2 purged keg. Again, I'm trying to avoid oxidation. That's my goal is not to make an undrinkable beer here. The beer was then burst carbonated at 50 PSI for 14 hours before I reduced the gas to serving pressure. And then I left it alone for 6 days to again, batch lager in my kegerator before I began serving it to tasters. So if you're adding this all up, you've got about 1 week, 2 weeks. It's about 2.5 weeks old by the time I'm serving it to tasters, as opposed to, 9 to 11 weeks.
This is the technique, right? We're going to see how well the beer comes out when you do this. Even probably by definition, lagering means to store. So, you did not store it that long, but hey, this is interesting. We got to see how it tastes. Let's Keller Czech Pilsner. So
there we go. And by the way it looked, you could argue that it was more Keller style. It was not brilliantly clear. It was definitely clear. You could see through the beer, but this has just been the case. And it's something that Jake and I have talked about a bit. When I use certain craft malts, Mecca Grade being one of them, for some reason, it takes a little bit longer for these beers to clear up. Maybe it's because of the higher protein content. I don't know. But this beer was not brilliant, though it had that perfect golden color with a very fluffy, sticky white head with very good retention.
Excellent. That's great. Looks great. I'm looking at a photo of the post right now. This looks great.
Yeah. I was happy with the way it turned out. I could have taken it being a little bit more clear, and it did clear up over the next 3 or 4 weeks. It did drop bright. So cool. I was pleased with, again, and I'm still drinking it, right? Like, hey, whatever. Yeah. It's around still. So now here's the deal. Before I served this to people, I started drinking it naturally, and I was not personally overly impressed with the way this beer turned out. It was not bad enough to dump. It was easy to drink, but we are our own worst critic. And in this case, when it comes to styles like Bo Pils that I love passionately, I'm even more critical about the stuff that I make. And this one it was good again, but it had this, what I described as kind of a new shoe character in the aroma. And it was kind of there in the retro nasal bit as well, like after you swallow and breathe out of your nose. And now new shoe has, people are going to put their own spin on what that means. I'm not talking about like that strong plasticky scent when you open up a new thing of shoes. I'm talking about that very subtle kind of almost factory like. I don't know how else to describe it, but that was how my brain wrapped its my mind around this character.
Like almost like a grease or an oily like a manufacturing smell, maybe metallic.
But it wasn't. It was not metallic, and it was not off-putting.
Okay.
Too off-putting, I should say. It was not something I wanted present there.
Sure.
And my initial thought was, this has got to be what I've heard people describe as when they overuse low alpha hops in a Pilsner style beer. I just couldn't help but wonder if this is what an overly pungent floral / spicy hop smells like. I don't know.
Sure. Maybe, I think it makes sense, right? I think we see this especially with American style craft brewing with very high hopping rates of hazy IPAs IPAs and IPAs in general, that when you push it, you get really weird flavors you're not expecting at all. So it makes sense.
Now, there's no way for us to know for sure that's what it came from, and I know that there are people out there who are presuming that it may have been an infection or something like that. So that it may well have been, and I've got reasons to believe it wasn't. But now this was, I did brew this one during COVID, but it was at around a time where we were starting to have contact with other people again. So I didn't collect too much data, but I did serve it to 12 blind participants. Well, they weren't really blind. We tell them what the style is, and then provide the BJCP style description before asking them to complete the survey while they're drinking it. So in terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seem to perceive the strongest characteristics in this Czech Premium Pale Lager as being the beer's dryness, which yielded an average rating of about 3.6 out of 5. Ratings on malty and hoppiness were around 2.7 and 2.2 out of 5, respectively.
Okay. Yeah, this makes sense. I mean, like you said, you weren't thrilled with the beer in terms of what it was showing. So maybe this was kind of a measurement of like people not making the moment of the styles as much, right? So I could see that, and it's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, but people liked it, right? It wasn't like, no, this is a bad example, but it was maybe a middle of the road or slightly worse example. So
well, I mean, just in terms of this average characteristic rating, I would have expected the maltiness. You know, if you're reading the BJCP descriptor, of Czech Premium Pale Lager, I would have expected the malty rating to be a little bit higher. And I just wondered if maybe that dryness, it got pretty dry. I mean, 1009 FG is pretty low, and especially with 5.9% ABV, that is going to create this impression of dryness as well. Maybe that kind of got in the way of some of that malty character. It could also just be that Mecha Grade, is perceptibly less malty, but that has not been my experience. So, but this is what the tasters rated. Now, we then asked them to rate more specifically hop character, malt character, and yeast character. For hops, 3 out of the 12 rated spicy and floral. So 3 out of 12 did spicy, 3 out of 12 rated floral, those being the most prominent hop characteristics in this beer. Another 2 tasters rated earthy, and another 2 rated melon, which that actually, the melon one makes sense to me with Sots. If you've ever opened a fresh bag of Sots and you smell it, I get kind of an under hint of kind of like a honeydew melon aroma from that sometimes.
Makes sense.
And then one person rated fruity and another person rated berry as being the most prominent hop characteristics. I would contend the spicy and floral was what I got, but it was interestingly pungent. And, you don't expect it to be that strong in a style like Bo Pills, but I used so much Sots that it makes sense to me that it was more unique. We'll call it that.
Sure. No, it makes sense. I mean, you used a lot, so I could see where you're pushing the upper limits of the flavor and the aroma of the style, which is atypical of using this in these styles of beer. So
yeah, and I think on a positive note, nobody endorsed pine resinous, dank caddy, or onion garlic as being the most prominent hop characteristics. Yeah, so in terms of the malt character, 6 out of 12 people, so half of them rated it as being cracker bread crust. I couldn't agree more. That's what I got out of it. 2 people each rated toasty, nutty, and caramel sweet. Again, all of those fit within the style to me. Maybe not the nutty thing, but I can see, using a craft malt getting kind of an undercurrent of like a kind of a nutty, toasty, nutty thing. Works in my mind. Nobody endorsed chocolate or roast. So
good. No one detected any roast malt in this beer. Excellent.
It's very rare though that somebody doesn't put roast on there a pale lager or whatever. But all right, for the yeast character, again, 8 out of 12 people said clean. That was what I would have rated it myself. It was such a clean fermentation character, which is what led me to think that this odd note that I was picking up was probably hop derived. Again, there's no way to know for sure. 2 people said they picked up a sulfur character in terms of fermentation. 1 person each endorsed phenolic, and then another person for esters. Nobody did wild. I did not get a phenolic thing from this, but again, my mind was already kind of aimed at the hop thing, being the reason for this odd character. I guess I could sort of see how that could have been perceived as almost like a subtle smoky, like phenolic character.
Yeah, I mean, and this gets to the off flavor that was mentioned because one person mentioned solvent character, and so when you're learning and judging beer, we've said this before. You have an innate ability to taste things, but your way you describe things is something you can learn. How you describe flavors and how you present flavors, and so when you talk about this note, you're saying this manufacturer or shoe note. I could absolutely see someone saying phenolic. I can absolutely see someone saying solvent, and that's, I think, what we're driving towards. But I'm really happy to see, even though this was a short and shoddy beer, vast majority of people are saying this is a clean fermentation, which is excellent.
Yeah, and that's what we're aiming for, right? I mean, it was fermented warm at ale temps. It was underpitched, and yet the fermentation character really did, in my opinion, it did display itself as being quite clean. Now, another person, in terms of off flavors, did report a yeasty note. Now, when I hear yeasty, what I tend to think of, or what I'm expecting in a yeasty beer, is almost this kind of slight rubbery thing. Mm-hmm. It's the way yeast smells to me, and it tastes exactly how it smells. I just had a fresh keg of Czech Pilsner was put on at Krone Wolf yesterday, and they poured off the first pour, and I was like, let me get a little taste of that, and it was all hazy, right? And it had that rubbery, yeasty note to it. Of course, as soon as they cleared the lines and they poured a few more off, it was crystal clear and great. Tasted completely different. So that yeasty note to me is not pleasant. One person appeared to pick it up, and I have to wonder if they weren't picking up what I'm calling this new shoe character, which one might perceive as being kind of rubbery.
Yeah, I think though this method, or though the short and shoddy method wants to make great beer every time, even given the circumstances. I mean, you're learning something, right? You're learning, I think we've learned a little bit in this process that, hey, maybe using 30-minute boil and a lot of first word hops to make your IBUs, maybe not the best thing for making the style. And maybe the yeast being pitched a little warm, maybe an older patch, maybe contribute to these things. But these are minor things, in my opinion. These are just recipe tweaks in the end, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Another question we ask is, how well does this represent the style based on the BJCP description? One person out of the 12 rated it a 5 out of 5, which means they think it's a perfect example of the style. I don't know what they were thinking, but whatever. 4 out of the 12 people rated it a 4 out of 5. 6 thought it was a 3 out of 5. If I were taking the survey, I'd have probably gone with a 3 out of 5 as well, because it was very representative. It had that Sots character. It was just a bit strong, in my opinion. Sure. One person gave it a 2 out of 5, and nobody rated it a 1 or a 0 out of 5. So this was clearly in the ballpark of a Czech Premium Pale Lager, and I think that's pretty cool.
That's awesome. I mean, like we said, I think you hit all the ingredient numbers, just process tweaks, that kind of thing. And no one wanted to hurt your feelings, Marshall. No one's going to give you a 1. So.
Well, they all of my friends like to hurt my feelings, so I trust that they were being honest. Yeah.
They're honest. Good. That's good.
Yeah. We then asked, our final question is just, how much did you like this beer? Basically, their preference rating. 1 out of 12 people rated it a 5 out of 5, and I know who this person was. They're not necessarily a close friend of mine, but they could not get enough of this beer, and I gave them as much as they wanted. Yeah. 5 people rated it a 4 out of 5. So that's already half of the people gave it a 4 out of 5 or higher. 4 people rated it a 3 out of 5. 2 gave it a 2 out of 5, and nobody rated it a 1 or a 0 out of 5. I probably would have been, again, this is my own subjective opinion, being my own worst critic. I'd have probably been in that 2 out of 5 range, just because of the fact that I got this note in it that it was easy for a lot of people to miss or look past. I could not. I was like obsessed with it. Every time I drank this beer, we did kick the keg. I did not dump it, and it was fine. but that's where we're at. Again, you got half of the people on this crazily brewed, short and shoddy Czech Premium Pale Lager who are saying this thing is great. It tastes really good. So I think that's pretty cool.
For me, the descriptions make sense. I think, if I tried it, I think I agree with like the 2 to 3 out of 5, just because of those issues. So for me, I've had batches of beer where I get the flavor. I can taste it. I brewed it. I can taste it. No one else can. And then I'm really upset, but no one else is, right? So you got to remember that stuff. You can be your own worst critic, but you can also be the person that only gets the off flavors because you knew it, or you're the one that can taste it, or something like that. So don't beat yourself. And there's something I've told other people, don't hate drink it. Don't drink it just because you don't like it. Enjoy it, give it to other people. And then if you really can't help yourself, then dump it. But, don't hate drink it. So.
Yeah, that's like the self-flagellation part of brewing, right? It's like, oh, I made this. I'm the one who screwed it up. I got to drink it now.
Exactly.
Well, I have made many batches of Czech Premium Pale Lager over the years using various abbreviated methods like reduced mash and boil lengths, as well as fermenting warmer. This one just didn't really hit the mark for me, and I'm not sure why. The slight issue I detected seemed to be fermentation related, though it's possible it was something else. I mean, this is the thing. I feel like fermentation gets blamed for a lot of the problems problems that people taste in beer. And understandably so, you've got a living organism doing the hard work for you. And if you don't treat them well, or you get a contaminant in there, yeah, I get it. Now, I initially did consider contamination as being the culprit here, but the fact that the FG never changed, and I measured it like 6 weeks after I kegged this beer up, just out of curiosity, the fact that never changed and the beer continued to clear up over time made me think that it likely was not a contamination. Another idea I had was that, again, like I mentioned earlier, was that the hefty amount of Sots I used for that first wort hop edition carried over into the flavor. And that is what, the more I think about it, the more I talk about it in this episode, that really is what I think it was. People often ask, what would you have done differently to make this beer better? I would have ditched, if I'm going to do a short and shoddy Czech Premium Pale Lager in the future, and the Sots that I have is under, 6 alpha acid, which it's going to be 6%, then I'm probably going to go with something like Magnum for that first bittering edition, just to get the bitterness that I want without all of that odd flavor carryover. Because you're going to still use a lot of Sots later on in the boil for that aroma and flavor, but it's also going to contribute a little bit of that bitterness. But I really do think that huge 125 gram first wort hop addition likely was what caused that oddness that I got out of this beer.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that is something that would be the first thing I would change, and I agree with your change. That's what I would be doing. So
yeah, and I will make this beer again, likely using the same exact methods, just swapping out that initial huge Sots addition with Magnum or Horizon, which, by the way, I love Horizon for a bittering edition. Still, the participants and most people I shared this beer with really did enjoy it. So based on that, I'd say that this was a moderate success. It was a clean, nicely fermented beer that people seemed to enjoy, even if they liked it more than I did. So
sweet.
Now we've got a couple of reader comments to get to. The first one comes from Eric, who says, "Give it some time. We all know the best pint of lager is the last pint." So Eric, here's the deal. I actually had this beer around for like 6-7 weeks after the article published, and while I do think it improved over time, it was not by much. The most improvement was in the clarity. It got crystal clear, but I still detected just this whisper of that weird flavor in the finish. Again, we drank the whole keg. I did not dump it, but it did not get to the point where I was completely satisfied with it.
Well, I don't think you're also, like you said, this flavor, it's not going away. In my experience doing this, and I've had batches of beer that I was like, why am I tasting this weird flavor, whatever? They tend not to just age out, right? Rarely will the age solve the problem you're describing. This is a chemical compound that's in the aroma. You're going to wait years, and the beer is going to taste much worse overall before that flavor aroma goes away. So
yeah, time heals a lot of things, but not all things.
Not everything.
We'll put it that way. So yeah. Next comment comes from Tim, who just asked, could it be that the short boil is what caused the off flavor?
It's possible. I mean, I think usually, so for me, when I do boils that are less than 60 minutes, what's the reason? So if it's time, or I don't care, or a big one is for the Berliner Weiss, where it's no boil or very low boil. My experience when it's that low is the beer malt flavor is very doughy. It drives the dough up a lot, not a phenolic or solvent character. So for me, you might want that character in the beer, right? You might want that really doughy kind of like fresh baked dough flavor and aroma, but usually not. It really drives all the other flavors off. So to me, I don't think the 30-minute one was that. If anything, the 30 minutes contributing to some DMS or something potentially, right? So I think it's this large amount of hops was the root cause, but maybe.
Yeah, I've done so many short boils. This was something that I was messing around with even before Brewlosophy was a thing. I'm just not convinced a 30-minute boil or a 25-minute boil is going to be that you're going to perceive some negative impact of that. But I think secondarily speaking, like we talked about, the fact that I did the short boil did mean that I had to use way more hops, and one could argue that it was ultimately the short boil's fault for this off flavor, if indeed it was the hops that caused it. So, Ricky J said, when you've brewed this recipe in the past, did you use a longer boil time and less bittering hops? Close to 7.5 ounces in 5 gallons, all under 25 minutes seems like a ton of hop material. I'm wondering if that could affect the character a bit. I've personally preferred the short boil lagers I've done with German Magnum for bittering as opposed to large amounts of low alpha noble hops, but that's purely anecdotal. So Ricky, I've brewed basically this same recipe many times. It's so simple. You don't really have to change it much. And I've used a variety of abbreviated methods. This is the only one I've brewed where I stacked all of those methods together into what we call short and shoddy. Now, I looked back at those recipes and found for the ones where I did a short boil, I did use higher alpha hops, right? Either Magnum or Horizon. So maybe that is the culprit. Again, I tend to think that that's likely it. I really don't think, though, that the boil length contributed to the off flavor, but it would make sense that given the reduced boil, the amount of low alpha sods needed to achieve the bitterness really affected the flavor. I feel like we're beating a dead horse with this, but a lot of people asked about it.
It's good. It's good to go over it.
Yeah. So, final comment comes from Nick Brown, who says, it seems like once you type the words glycol chiller, you've abandoned all pretense of shoddiness. Okay, Nick, here's the deal. I know you said it before, but I'm going to say it again just to get it out there. The short and shoddy series has never been intended and will never be intended to purposefully engage in practices with the hopes of making a bad beer. It's the exact opposite. It's why we still do things like control fermentation temps and pressure transfer to purged kegs. Rather, the idea is to make the best beer possible while cutting certain corners, which is informed by past experiment results. I use a glycol chiller because it's more convenient than a chest freezer for me. I spent the money on a glycol chiller so that I could save some space in my garage. I'm beyond pleased with my purchase. The name, I get it, understandably makes it sound like we're trying to make bad beer, short and shoddy, but that is not the case at all. Where did this name come from? I get this question all the time, and so I'm going to say it publicly here again, just so people stop emailing me. What do you call it that? A lot of people thought it was because of my last name, right? Shoddy, shot, whatever. As I've mentioned before, my real job is in a prison. And when inmates are getting close to their parole date, they tend to get a bit antsy, which is colloquially referred to as being, I'm going to swear here, short and shitty. Yes. So I kind of stole that term from my regular, real life job and applied it to the brewing stuff that I do now because I thought it was kind of fun. So that is all this is about. We're not trying to make bad beer. Andy, maybe you want to try to make bad beer.
I might make short and shitty. So great.
So that is the case. I do think that about covers it for Czech Premium Pale Lager, aka Bohemian Pilsner. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up, Andy?
I think this is a great one to do as a short and shoddy. I think we saw here where you might have pitfalls because of recipe choices, because of the technique, but then do this, right? I mean, I'm impressed with the fact that you pitched warm and still made a very clean beer. I'm impressed with the fact that all the flavors seem to hang together, and I think there's a couple tweaks, and this is even better, right? And so, like you said, we're not trying to make a bad or a poor beer. We're trying to just speed the process up, and you learn something along the way, right? And as long as we're learning something and making a beer you want to drink, I think we nailed it. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like I said, swap out that initial bittering charge with some Magnum or some Horizon, and I think you got yourself a really fine Bohemian Pilsner. Well, please remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab, our podcast where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing experts so that you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget that you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Czech Premium Pale Lager. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman. No.